Jon Snow stood on the high walls of King's Landing, a silent sentinel gazing out over a city that had changed hands too many times to count. The wind pulled at his hair, which was streaked with silver from years in the north, and his dark cloak flapped behind him like the wings of a crow. So much had happened in this very place, and so many ghosts lingered in its rubble and ashes. He remembered the day he had once refused the Iron Throne, the day he had knelt by the broken body of Daenerys Targaryen, tears in his eyes, a sense of both awe and dread in his heart. Time had a way of turning every memory into a distant echo, but now, looking upon this ancient stronghold, he could almost see her face again. Resolute, merciful at times, and yet filled with a consuming fire that devoured anything in its path. He shifted his weight and felt the ache in his knees, the strain in his shoulders, reminders of the toll his many battles and journeys had taken. Jon had never sought glory. He had never truly wanted power. He had followed duty, the path that honor demanded. Yet here he was, the leader of a cause so vast that it stretched across continents, forging alliances with peoples he had never dreamed to speak with. They called themselves the Global Alliance Against Dragons, though it was whispered in certain halls that their true purpose was the extermination of the Targaryen line, root and stem. Jon hated how that goal twisted his stomach into knots of guilt and sadness. There had been a time when he believed dragons were harbingers of hope, symbols of renewal for the realm. He had fought side by side with Daenerys against the army of the dead, trusting her as an ally, perhaps something more once, but so much had changed. He still carried the burden of his own Targaryen blood. The knowledge that he, too, had been born from the line of Aegon the Conqueror, that he was in fact Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, haunted him. He had seen what Targaryen blood could do, both in its most triumphant and most terrifying forms. Daenerys had begun as a liberator, the breaker of chains, and ended with her shadow stretching across the world like a monstrous wing. The skulls of dragons once lined the halls beneath the Red Keep, a testament to their power, and also to the realm's ability to rid itself of them. Now, dragons soared again, wild and unbridled, bearing Targaryen heirs and distant pretenders who claimed some link to the blood of old Valyria. For a time, it had seemed that the days of dragons were once more the symbol of a new age, but that new age had brought wars far deadlier than any in living memory. Jon Snow never intended to lead another war. After the Great War against the Night King, all he had wanted was peace. He wanted the quiet hush of winter snows on the wall, the sound of a direwolf's paws padding alongside him, the camaraderie of friends free from the ambitions of lords and kings. He had desired a simple life, exiled beyond the wall, content to let the realm sort itself out. But the realm had other ideas. Word came of roving dragon lords, some rumored to be bastards of Daenerys' line, others claiming to be cousins from Essos, each one harnessing the dreadful power of living flame. The realms of men recoiled in terror. Fleets burned upon the seas, cities fell in smoldering ruin, entire families were incinerated in their keeps, and the whisper of a name began to spread across the lands. Targaryen, the scourge of the living. One by one, the lords looked for a champion, a unifying figure with both the name and the credibility to stand against such might. Jon Snow, the secret Targaryen who had once slain a queen to save a kingdom, was seen as the only man who could inspire confidence in every corner of the realm. It took years for Jon to accept that the threat of dragons was real, that it was not merely an isolated incident or the rogue actions of a few power-hungry riders. Mages from Ashai spoke of portents in the flames. The dragons were multiplying. Clutches of eggs were rumored to have been discovered in the far reaches of the Red Waste, and in shadowy regions beyond the Jade Sea. Others whispered that dragons were breeding in the wild, unclaimed by any human master, forging lairs in mountain peaks or hidden valleys, terrorizing unsuspecting villages far from the known roads. Tales came from as far as Ulthos and Sithorios, each more horrifying than the last. Men who had once served Daenerys in her quest to break slavery now found themselves hunted, for some rumored that certain Targaryen loyalists sought living proof of her great conquests. Banners, testimonies, any sign that they deserved to restore her vision of the world. Fear spread faster than ravens could fly, At first, the leaders of the Seven Kingdoms tried to downplay the threat. After Daenerys' death, each region had grown self-interested. Sansa Stark, Queen in the North, had no wish to march her troops into faraway lands again. Yara Greyjoy strengthened the Iron Islands, building a fleet to protect her coasts. Bran the Broken, content with being a figurehead king in King's Landing, remained aloof, consumed with his enigmatic visions and abstractions of time. And so these small pockets of Targaryen pretenders and their dragons went unchecked, burning and pillaging in Essos, in the Summer Islands, and even near the coasts of Westeros when they felt bold. Yet with each year, the number of dragons grew, and with it, their destructive capabilities. Trade routes burned. Alliances faltered. Panic took root. All the while, Jon tried to ignore the calls for him to lead. He was done with kings and queens, with wars of crowns. But news arrived that a village near the Gift had been razed by a monstrous red dragon rumored to be bigger than Drogon had ever been. The Night's Watch, thinly staffed as it was, managed a feeble defense, but to no avail. Dozens died, and the farmland was turned to ash. That, for Jon, was the moment he understood he could not stand aside. The cycle was repeating itself, and if it continued, no corner of the world would be safe. He thought of how Daenerys had once promised to break the wheel, how she had set out to end tyranny forever. Yet in her wake, the seeds of something even darker had taken root. He traveled south to confer with his sister Sansa. She had matured into a formidable ruler, her once naive eyes now sharpened by hardships. She begged Jon not to shoulder this burden alone. She insisted that the lords of Westeros must come together, that a single man could not bear the weight of an entire world's fear. But Jon knew that if dragons were truly banding together under some new Targaryen banner, or worse yet, if they were multiplying without human direction, then they needed a figure who had first-hand experience of their might, someone with Targaryen blood yet who stood apart from its legacy. His name alone, Snow or Targaryen, might rally the fractured kingdoms into a single force. Sansa reluctantly agreed, and from that moment, a slow shift in the realm's power began. He called upon Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, to help broker alliances with Essos, where the threat was strongest. Davos's voice, once indispensable to King Stannis, proved just as critical now. He traveled across the narrow sea, meeting with merchant lords in Pentos, Bravos, and Volantis, forging the bedrock of what would eventually become the global alliance against dragons. The Bravosi, proud and wealthy, had no love for dragonfire scorching their trade routes. The Volantines, once enthralled by Daenerys' liberation of slaves, now felt betrayed by her legacy. A few Targaryen loyalists still lingered in Meereen and Astapor, but they were in disarray, uncertain where they stood in this new world. Over months of negotiation, Davos convinced them all that this was not a simple matter of Westerosi politics, but a crisis that threatened everyone. Envoys were sent to the Summer Islands, to the Jade Seaports, to the Dothraki Khalasars who had scattered after Daenerys' death, and even to the recently resurgent Qarth, all bearing the same plea: join us or be consumed by Dragonflame. The initial response was scattered. Some believed the threat was exaggerated, that dragons, while fearsome, were too few to pose such an existential risk. Others demanded enormous sums of gold or promises of territory in exchange for their support. Yet as more reports trickled in of dragons nesting in remote valleys, plundering caravans, and torching fields, the tide of public opinion changed. Fear united them. For Jon, each new alliance came with new responsibilities. He did not crown himself a king. If anything, he acted as a cautious figurehead, letting others handle the pomp and ceremony. His purpose was to direct strategy, to lend his name and presence, to show that a man who had once befriended dragons and fought alongside their mother was also the man who understood the necessity of stopping them. Still, the moral weight of it pressed upon him. He remembered Rhaegal, the dragon named for his father, carrying him into battle against the undead. He remembered the sense of wonder and bond he had felt, a feeling that transcended mortal limitations. Now he sought the death of every dragon in existence. He tried to tell himself that they had become too numerous, too dangerous, that the world was not ready for them, that every place they appeared they wrought destruction. In unguarded moments, He could almost see Daenerys's face, could almost hear her voice reminding him of how she had hatched her dragons from cold stone, how they had symbolized rebirth, hope against all odds, tore at his heart. Across the sea, pockets of Targaryen loyalists began to band together, some claiming that Daenerys' true son had been smuggled away at birth, or that a daughter had been secreted off by one of her loyal handmaidens. Most of these claimants were dismissed as charlatans, but a few garnered real support. Chief among them was a man calling himself Aeron Stormborn, who had tamed a colossal black dragon with piercing green eyes. Rumors described it as the offspring of Drogon and some unknown female dragon. Aeron's claim of direct lineage was flimsy, yet to those who yearned for the return of Targaryen power, it hardly mattered. He was a dragon rider, bold and fearsome, and he spoke of finishing Daenerys' work, uniting the world under a single throne. Armies flocked to him from Essos, from the remnants of the Golden Company to the Sellsword bands that had once fought against Daenerys. The swirl of conflicting rumors made it impossible to discern truth from propaganda, but one thing was certain. Aeron's dragon was real, and it was devastating. The first true battle of what would become the world's flame war happened near the city of Lys, as the Global Alliance's fleet arrived to reinforce the local defenders against Aeron's forces. Jon was not there in person, but the accounts were horrifying. The black dragon, named Nightmaw, unleashed a torrent of green-tinged fire so hot that it melted the stone walls. Thousands perished in a single night, the shrieks of the dying reverberating over the water until dawn. Though the defenders repelled the invasion at terrible cost, the city of Lys was left half in ruins, its harbor choked with burned ships and charred bodies. That moment erased all doubt from the global powers. The dragons were a threat too terrible to ignore. Now, no one questioned the necessity of uniting behind Jon Snow's banner. The forging of the alliance took 2 more years, with each kingdom, each free city, each independent domain sending delegates to meet in Braavos. Tense negotiations followed. The Yunkish demanded that they not be forced to give up the institution of slavery in exchange for their participation, a condition that appalled many, Jon included, but the precarious nature of the alliance meant turning away no potential allies, and so half measures and compromises were made. The Dothraki Khalasars demanded that their warriors be free to raid certain territories as payment for their loyalty, which caused further rifts. It was an unsteady unity at best, a tapestry of conflicting interests barely held together by the looming menace of unstoppable dragonfire. Jon tried to swallow his revulsion. He had once fought to free slaves. Now he would march alongside slavers. He had once rid the world of rapacious, lawless hordes. Now he would count them as allies. The cause justified the means, he told himself. Their single-minded goal was to end the threat that overshadowed every corner of the earth. If they failed, then none of these distinctions would matter in the face of total annihilation. And so he stood in Braavos, listening as delegates bickered over the smallest details of treaties, wishing that there could be a simpler way. He needed each and every one of them if they were going to stand a chance against the combined might of dragons across the known world. It was an irony not lost on him that while Daenerys had once struggled to free Essos with her 3 dragons, now he struggled to unite Essos against the threat of hundreds of dragons in various hands. At last, the hammer fell. Aeron Stormborn launched a grand assault on the city of Meereen, hoping to claim it as the seat of his would-be empire. The Braavosi intelligence network warned of the movement days in advance, giving Jon just enough time to lead a coalition force across the sea. He arrived at Meereen to find black sails on the horizon, the sigil of a 3-headed dragon scrawled upon them in silver. It was a bastardized design, reminiscent of Daenerys' banners but altered to suit Aeron's twisted narrative. Jon stood on the deck of his flagship, tension knotting his chest. Memories of his time in Meereen came rushing back. He had never spent much of his life here, but he recalled the stories Daenerys had told him, how she had taken the city, freed the slaves, struggled to maintain peace. The siege that followed was brutal. Aeron's forces deployed war machines in tandem with the savage strikes of Nightmaw, the Black Dragon. Jon's coalition scrambled to answer, fielding scorpions and ballistae based on Qyburn's old designs, improved by the cunning engineers of Volantis and Braavos. The defenders perched high on the walls, launching volley after volley of bolts into the smoky sky, but hitting a dragon in mid-flight proved exceedingly difficult. Nightmaw's scales gleamed like obsidian, and the beast seemed to move with an almost preternatural speed. Explosive pots hurled by trebuchets lit up the night sky, turning each hour of darkness into a hellscape of roaring fire and screaming men. Jon directed the defense from the city walls, aided by a mix of local commanders and foreign advisors. Ghost, his faithful albino direwolf, stayed close, baring his teeth at every roar of dragonfire. The old wolf had grown grizzled, with a scar across his muzzle from a battle long ago, but still followed Jon without fear. Jon felt a pang of guilt whenever he saw Ghost recoil from the flames in the sky. Ghost had fought wights and monstrous creatures before, but this was different. This was a threat from above, unstoppable and ancient. Every time Nightmaw swooped low, unleashing infernos upon the defenders, Ghost let out a low, angry howl that mingled with the screams of men burned alive. Meereen's mighty walls and the formidable alliance numbers held out for 3 days. The city had long been transformed since Daenerys' reign, no longer reliant on the old fighting pits or the slave masters who had once dominated it. But the scalding desert sun, combined with the daily barrage of fire from above, created a nightmarish environment within. Water became scarce, and illusions of an easy victory faded. Jon knew that if they did not break Aeron's forces soon, Meereen would fall once more into the hands of a dragon-backed tyrant. On the dawn of the 4th day, Jon rode out with a contingent of cavalry drawn from the Vale and Dorne, determined to disrupt Aeron's lines of supply. Dust churned under the hooves of their horses as they galloped across the plain. The drums of war beat ominously in the distance. Overhead, he saw the dark shape of Nightmaw circling, though it did not immediately dive for them. Perhaps Aeron believed the city to be on the brink of collapse and saw no need to engage Jon directly. An uneasy hope flared in Jon's chest. If he could strike at the enemy camp and cause enough confusion, maybe it would give Meereen a chance to regroup. They succeeded in taking the besiegers by surprise. The camp's perimeter guards were scattered, many dozing from exhaustion after a night of relentless assaults. Jon's cavalry cut through tents and supply wagons, setting them alight. Briefly, it felt like a victory, but then came the beating of colossal wings, and Jon's heart turned to ice as Nightmaw descended in a swirl of black smoke. The ground shook under the dragon's landing, and the cavalry horses whinnied in terror. Jon brandished a specially crafted spear tipped with dragonglass and steel, though he knew in his heart that it was a feeble answer to a dragon's scale and flame. Nightmaw roared, a deafening sound that rattled the nerves of every man present. Flames erupted from its jaws. Jon and the others scattered, forcing their steeds to swerve desperately out of the cone of inferno. A few were not fast enough. Their screams died in the roar of the fire. In the chaos, Jon caught sight of a figure atop the dragon. A man garbed in black and silver, with hair so blonde it shone like pale gold. Aeron Stormborn, the self-styled heir of Daenerys, had a cruel smile twisting his lips as he urged his dragon to rend the battlefield with more fire. Bolts from crossbows whizzed through the air, but most bounced harmlessly off Nightmaw's scales or clattered on the ground. Jon spurred his horse forward, leaning low, the wind whipping at his face as he tried to close the distance. It was madness. He had fought the undead, faced down White Walkers, and led armies against the greatest evils the world had known. But nothing had prepared him for the raw, unstoppable power of a fully mature dragon in the heat of battle. Still, he pushed onward. A memory rose unbidden in his mind. Daenerys smiling at him in the glow of a campfire, the first time she asked if he wanted to ride a dragon. His heart clenched at the recollection, but he forced the sentiment away. He aimed the spear at the dragon's flank, an impossible move at full gallop, and hurled it with all the strength he could muster. The spear flew true, but Nightmaw was in motion. The tip glanced off a ridge of armor-like scales, skittering away uselessly. Atop the beast, Aeron laughed. Jon felt rage and desperation surge through his veins. His horse reared, threatened by the swirling flames, and he narrowly maintained his seat. Another cavalryman charged forward, brandishing a scorpion bolt in hand, but he was bathed in fire before he could throw it. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Jon pulled the reins of his horse sharply, turning away as blasts of heat licked at his side. The rescue mission had turned into a suicidal show of bravery, but he had no choice. They could not let Nightmaw freely prey upon the Alliance forces. Suddenly, a volley of scorpion bolts launched from Meereen's walls. The city's defenders must have seen Jon's charge and decided to provide covering fire. The bolts soared in a lethal arc. Nightmaw twisted, unleashing flame at several of them, reducing the wooden shafts to char before they could strike. Yet one bolt angled in from below, catching the dragon's left wing with a forceful crack. Nightmaw roared in pain, rearing back. Aaron clung to the saddle, nearly unseated. That was enough of an opening FO. Are Jon's cavalry to retreat and regroup, pulling back toward the city. The ground attack had cost them dearly, but they had succeeded in wounding the dragon, even if slightly. Blood spattered across the sand, scalding hot and dark, turning the soil to clumps of blackened mud. In the aftermath, Meereen found a brief lull in the assault. Nightmaw circled high, clearly favoring its injured wing. Aaron's troops on the ground had been denied crucial supplies, forcing them to ration their resources. Jon, battered and scarred, returned within the gates to the cheers of the defenders, though he felt no triumph in his heart. He knew that many good men had died that day, and the dragon still lived. In the city squares, the wounded lay on pallets, their faces blackened by soot, bodies wrapped in bloody bandages. The coalition's healers worked tirelessly, but even the best of them could do little for those suffering from extensive burns. Jon walked among them, offering what reassurance he could. Guilt gnawed at him, an old familiar sensation. That night, he met with his high command in the pyramid that Daenerys once used as her seat. He could almost feel her presence there, a ghost in the walls. Strategic maps were laid out across a great wooden table. Generals from the free cities argued with Westerosi knights over the next move. A representative from the Dothraki demanded an open-field confrontation, claiming that the Dothraki were unmatched in such battles. The Volantene commander insisted on biding their time, letting the enemy starve. Through it all, Jon listened, eyes drawn to the flicker of torchlight against the map that depicted the known world. Westeros, Essos, the Summer Islands, Sothorios, and lands beyond. He could see how small they all were next to the wide unknown. Finally, he stood. The room fell silent. "We cannot cower behind these walls forever," Jon said in a low voice, each word resonating with quiet strength. "We wounded Nightmaw, but that will only make Aaron more determined. By dawn, we ride out in force. If he wants Meereen, let him try to take it from our lines rather than from the sky." Some generals looked aghast, but none could muster a direct protest. They had all witnessed how the defenders had managed to temporarily chase off the dragon with coordinated scorpion fire. Perhaps a bold offensive was indeed what they needed. Plans were laid. Squires and servants rushed through the corridors, distributing orders. The hammers in the foundries pounded late into the night, forging fresh bolts. Jon stood watch on a balcony overlooking the city, Ghost at his side, his breath smoking in the cool desert air. Below, the streets teemed with the activity of a city on the brink of a decisive battle. Up above, the stars glittered with indifference. At dawn, the horns sounded. The city gates opened, and a unified force poured onto the plains to face Aaron's army. The sun crested the horizon, bathing the broken siege lines in a fierce orange glow. A hush fell over both sides, as if nature itself paused to acknowledge the gravity of what was about to happen. For a moment, Jon recalled the Battle of the Bastards, the tension before the armies clashed in the north. This, however, felt even more dire. Even if they won the day, there were other dragons out there, other would-be conquerors and opportunists. This war was not about dethroning a single mad king or queen. It was about saving the world from an unleashed scourge. The two armies charged. Steel met steel. War cries split the air. The thunder of hooves shook the earth. Above it all, Nightmaw's roar announced the dragon's descent from the cloud-streaked sky. Arrows and bolts streaked upward to meet the beast. Some found their mark, most did not. Fire rained down upon the coalition ranks, forcing men to scatter. Jon had positioned Scorpion teams at various points, protected by rows of infantry with large shields. They loosed bolt after bolt at the dragon. Many missed, but enough hit for Nightmaw to wheel away, a ragged tear visible in its left wing from the earlier wound. The advantage was slight but meaningful. With each breath of fire, the dragon's fury lit the sky, and with each new volley of scorpion bolts, the defenders tested fate. Jon found himself in the thick of the melee on the ground, leading a wedge of mounted knights. He wielded Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword bequeathed to him by Jeor Mormont. The sword flashed with lethal precision, cutting through enemy spearmen who tried to break their line. Ghost darted between the horses, his white fur streaked with the blood of those who threatened Jon. The clang of metal and the screams of dying men surrounded them. Dust rose in clouds, obscuring vision, but Jon pressed on, guided by the glimpses of black scales overhead. He locked eyes with Aeron Stormborn, who flew low enough on Nightmaw that Jon could see the man's sneer. For an instant, their gazes met across the chaos. Jon saw not just a pretender but a zealot, someone so convinced of his own destiny that he would incinerate the world to achieve it. Nightmaw blasted a line of flame into the ranks of foot soldiers near Jon. He heard their agonized cries, the whoosh of air igniting. He felt heat against his face, turning his sweat to steam. Suddenly, a scorpion bolt whizzed dangerously close to Nightmaw's head. The dragon reared, flapping its massive wings, sending gusts of wind that blew dust into the air. Aeron tugged on the reins, urging the dragon upward. Jon seized the moment. He spurred his horse toward a scorpion team stationed on higher ground. They turned the ballista, aiming carefully. Jon dismounted, ignoring the swirling melee around him, and helped crank the mechanism into position. The aim was precarious. Dust stung his eyes. In the distance, he saw Nightmaw's silhouette ascending, about to circle for another deadly pass. "Steady!" Jon shouted to the crew, his voice hoarse. The soldiers around him tried to keep the ballista aligned, though many were trembling with fear. Nightmaw banked left, exposing its injured wing. "Now!" Jon roared. The scorpion bolt shot forward with a thunderous crack, slicing through the air. In that moment, Jon's breath caught in his throat. Time seemed to slow. Nightmaw twisted in an attempt to evade, but the timing was perfect. The bolt punched into the dragon's wing near the joint, tearing through scale and sinew, pinning the membrane briefly to the dragon's side. Nightmaw's roar was ear-shattering, a cry of agony that made men drop their weapons to cover their ears. The dragon convulsed in the sky, losing altitude, black blood spraying from the wound, pattering onto the battlefield below like rain. Aeron clung desperately to the saddle. Nightmaw tried to flap its shredded wing, but only managed an awkward half-glide, careening out of control. The beast smashed into the ground with a thunderous impact, sending a shockwave of dust and shattered earth. Soldiers from both sides were knocked off their feet. Jon shielded his eyes, feeling the tremor under his boots. As the debris settled, he saw Nightmaw thrashing, trying to rise. Its great head snapped at anything that moved. Aeron was thrown clear, tumbling across the ground in a swirl of black cloak and silver armor. Jon's heart pounded. This was their chance. He sprinted forward, sword in hand. Around him, coalition soldiers rushed in to pin the wounded dragon with ropes and grappling hooks. He watched as Nightmaw's maw erupted with a final blast of flame, consuming a dozen men in an instant. The stench of scorched flesh filled the air. Still, more men closed in, plunging spears into the beast's flanks, though many of the spears broke against the scales. The fight was not over. Nightmaw's tail lashed violently, crushing men and horses alike. The earth seemed to quake under the dragon's dying fury. Amid the pandemonium, Jon spotted Aeron scrambling to his feet. The pretender was battered and bleeding, but rage glinted in his eyes. He drew a Valyrian steel sword of his own. How he had come by it was anyone's guess, and charged at Jon. Their blades met in a scream of steel. Jon's arms shook from the force. Aaron was strong, fueled by wrath and a sense of righteous destiny. Jon parried desperately, the ring of metal against metal echoing across the battlefield. Each stroke threatened to be his last. He could feel how close to the edge he was, how easy it would be to slip and fall beneath that deadly blade. They broke apart for a heartbeat, circling. Beyond them, Nightmaw let out another agonized roar, still pinned by scorpion bolts and tangled ropes. Flames flickered at the edges of the dragon's jaws, but the beast seemed too wounded to spew another inferno. In that pause, Aaron spat. "You are a traitor to your own blood, bastard. You killed Daenerys. You kill her children now. Everything you touch, you betray." Jon's breathing was ragged. He saw the fanaticism in Aaron's eyes, recognized the same glimmer he once glimpsed in Daenerys when she had spoken of her destiny to break the wheel. He thought of the thousands who had died under her final act of conquest. He recalled the screams in King's Landing. He was no traitor. He was simply a man trying to save the living from a nightmare that would devour them all. If that made him the villain in the eyes of Targaryen loyalists, so be it. They clashed again, swords flashing, dust swirling around them. Aaron's technique was swift and vicious, but Jon was more seasoned, tempered by years of war. He sidestepped a downward slash, slammed his pommel into Aaron's ribs, and then swept low with long claw, cutting into the man's thigh. Aaron stumbled, letting out a guttural cry. He tried to raise his blade again, but Jon pressed the advantage, knocking the weapon from Aaron's grip and kicking him to the ground. Aaron's eyes blazed with defiance as he lay sprawled. Jon stood over him, sword raised. In that instant, their surroundings faded. The roaring dragon, the armies locked in brutal combat, the swirl of smoke and dust. It was just two men, both touched by Targaryen fire, both shaped by a destiny they had not chosen. Jon saw no redemption in Aaron's gaze, only an unquenchable thirst for dominion. He brought Longclaw down, piercing Aaron's chest, feeling the blade crunch through armor and bone. Aaron's final breath escaped in a rattling gasp, blood staining his lips. Then he was gone. A pretender who had led an army and a dragon, undone on a battlefield in a faraway city. Almost immediately, Nightmaw let out a keening wail, as if it sensed the death of its rider. The beast thrashed once more, snapping the ropes that bound it. Before Jon could react, it lunged, jaws wide. He flung himself aside, barely avoiding the massive teeth. Coalition soldiers rushed in, thrusting spears and driving scorpion bolts at close range. Dozens died in those last, frenzied seconds as Nightmaw flailed in agony and wrath, but the combined weight of the assault eventually took its toll. A final scorpion bolt slammed into the dragon's skull, penetrating through its eye socket and into its brain. Nightmaw collapsed in a heap of scorched scales, dust billowing as its colossal form went still. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by moans of the wounded and the crackle of lingering fires. Jon stood, battered and coughing, as the adrenaline drained from his body. He surveyed the carnage. Hundreds of dead, perhaps thousands, scattered across the plain. The battered banners of the Global Alliance hung limp in the smoky air. In the distance, the remains of Aaron's army either surrendered or fled, their morale shattered by the death of their leader and his dragon. Meereen stood, battered but unbroken. For that moment, it felt like a significant victory, even if Jon knew the war was far from one. He walked amid the bodies, ignoring the jubilant cheers of some coalition troops. Ghost padded at his side, sniffing warily among the dead. Jon felt only weariness. They had killed Nightmaw, arguably the most fearsome dragon anyone had ever seen. But there were others out there, perhaps not as large, but numerous enough to threaten entire continents. And then there were the Targaryen bloodlines, some rumored, some real, scattered across distant lands. The vow of the Global Alliance was clear. No more dragons. No more Targaryens. Days later, after Meereen began to recover, Jon convened a council of the highest-ranking members of the Alliance. They gathered in the old throne room, where a carved dragon mural still adorned the walls. Ironic, considering the purpose of this meeting. There, Jon laid out a harsh truth. The threat was not just from claimants like Aaron. The real danger lay in the unhatched clutches, the wild dragons breeding far from civilization, the hidden pockets of Targaryen loyalists who guarded eggs as precious heirlooms. Unless they systematically eradicated every last dragon and any who might breed them, the world would remain on the brink of annihilation. He hated the words even as he spoke them. He remembered the day he had watched Daenerys hatch her dragons on a funeral pyre, the way they had seemed like miracles. Now he was commanding that they be hunted to extinction. Yet the faces around him, foreign lords, princes, Sellsword captains, and ex-slaves, nodded in agreement. They had tasted the bitter reality of dragonfire, and they did not wish to taste it again. So began the Great Dragon Hunt. Over the next 5 years, the Alliance expanded its reach, sending expeditions to every corner of Essos, to the Shadowlands beyond Aas-High, to the steaming jungles of Sithorios, and even across the Sunset Sea to rumored lands. Teams of knights, assassins, and bounty hunters scoured the known world in search of eggs, hatchlings, and rumored Targaryen scions. In time, a chilling rumor spread. The Alliance had also begun to root out any with even a hint of Valyrian blood. The impetus was clear. They feared that any spark of Targaryen ancestry might one day produce or tame a dragon. In Essos, some Targaryen bastards were publicly executed. Others were dragged away in chains, never to be heard from again. Though the Alliance's stated goal was only the extermination of dragons, fear and paranoia led to witch hunts that targeted entire families suspected of harboring Targaryen blood. Jon had not intended this. He had never wanted to see innocent lives cut short simply for their lineage. But the unstoppable momentum of war had taken on a life of its own. He was the Alliance's figurehead, and no matter how often he tried to rein in the cruelty, powerful lords and zealots twisted the original mission into a purge. To protest too loudly would be to divide the fragile alliance that still needed to remain united against pockets of dragons and riders scattered across the globe. So he compromised, trying to insist that suspicion alone was not enough cause for execution, trying to call for fair trials. But war left little room for mercy. The unstoppable machine of fear churned onward. In Westeros, a wave of panic seized the small folk. Whispers abounded of half-Targaryen children in Flea Bottom or secret Targaryen enclaves in Dorne. The faith of the Seven, re-empowered in the absence of a strong monarchy, preached that Targaryen blood was cursed, a relic of black magic from Valyria. Jon watched, powerless, as septas and septons riled the masses, calling for the eradication of dragon spawn in the name of the Seven. He turned to his siblings for counsel, Sansa in Winterfell, Bran in King's Landing. But they too were grappling with the unstoppable tide of paranoia and vengeance. Bran remained inscrutable, though Jon sensed he disapproved. Sansa wrote letters urging a calmer approach, but her hold on the north was fragile, and her people had not forgotten the devastation Daenerys had brought upon the land. The memory of the near ruin of King's Landing, the capital of the realm, fueled the hatred still smoldering. It seemed that everywhere Jon turned, he found the same unrelenting call. No more dragons. Over time, the Alliance claimed victories. They tracked down lesser dragons that had established lairs in the Bone Mountains, confronting them with specialized scorpion teams. Some expeditionary forces ventured into the Basilisk Isles, discovering bizarre mutated reptiles rumored to be the spawn of dragons that had once flown there. They burned entire nests, smashing eggs under iron boots. Some hunts ended in tragedy, as the beasts claimed hundreds of lives before being brought down. But the Alliance was committed, fueled by a combination of fear, vengeance, and a twisted sense of justice. Each dragon skull shipped back to the capitals was paraded through the streets, a gruesome trophy that reminded the people why they fought. Jon felt his soul grow heavier with each new success. The banners bearing the emblem of the Global Alliance against dragons flew across every major port, but the cost of their campaign left him hollow. The joy he might once have felt in unifying the world was tainted by the atrocities carried out in the name of safety. He tried to maintain a distinction in his mind, that the ultimate goal, saving countless lives from the devastation dragons could inflict, justified these measures. Yet he could not shake the feeling that he was betraying everything he had stood for. He had once pledged to protect the living, to guard them from the horrors beyond the wall. Now, he led a hunt that sometimes descended into the murder of children suspected of Targaryen lineage. At night, he dreamed of Daenerys looking at him with sad, accusing eyes, her hair silver gold, her voice silent yet filled with reproach. As the months turned into years, the alliance's net tightened around the last remnants of Daenerys' bloodline. The largest remaining cluster of Targaryen loyalists was rumored to be holed up in the far reaches of the Red Waste, near the very spot Daenerys had hatched her dragons decades before. Leading them was a woman who called herself Visenya Targaryen, though no official records existed to confirm she was truly of the blood. She possessed a single dragon, smaller than Nightmaw but still a terrible force of destruction. She named the creature Sorrow, for it had been hatched from an egg found in the ruins of Vis Taloro, the City of Bones. Intelligence suggested that Visenya planned to gather other exiles and seeds of the Targaryen line in a last-ditch stand, an act of desperation and defiance against the unstoppable alliance. Word reached Jon that Visenya's dragon had been sighted near the Valley of the Whispers. With a heavy heart, he led a united army across the Red Waste, forging ahead under the blazing sun, their supplies hauled by caravans and ships hugging the coast whenever possible. The journey was punishing. Dozens collapsed from heatstroke, horses perished, water grew scarce. The men marched on, driven by fear as much as by duty. Along the way, they found villages ravaged by the desert climate and turned desolate by the war that had raged for so long now. People had fled or been killed, leaving behind only bleached skeletons of huts and the remains of half-buried caravans. Jon camped on the edge of a barren canyon, peering through a haze of heat at the jagged ridges that concealed Visenya's hideout. He posted scouts day and night, but no sign of the dragon emerged. Rumors ran rampant, each new tale more fearful than the last. Some claimed Visenya had tamed a second dragon, others that she was pregnant with a child who would one day unite all Targaryens. At times, Jon found himself wondering if this was all a mirage, a product of the Alliance's paranoia run amok. Yet no one could deny that a dragon had been sighted, that it had destroyed caravans in the area. After weeks of fruitless searching, Jon learned from a captured loyalist that Visenya had taken refuge in a hidden valley accessible through a narrow gorge. The way was treacherous, flanked by towering cliffs. Leading a large army in would be risky, as they could be ambushed from above. But time was running short, and the Alliance forces were weary of endless desert marches. Against his better judgment, Jon ordered a contingent to scout the gorge. They set off at dawn, only to return at twilight with half their number missing and stories of flaming boulders crashing down from the canyon walls. Clearly, Visenya had prepared a defense. The next day, siege engines were brought up. Over the following week, the Alliance tried to force a path through the gorge, inch by inch, building makeshift ramps, blasting the canyon walls with catapult barrages. Men died by the score, but eventually they made progress. Jon stood at the mouth of the gorge, exhaustion etched into his features. His armor was coated in dust, his lips cracked from the relentless heat. Ghost lay panting beside him. He looked at his war council, men and women from across the known world, hardened by years of conflict. Their eyes told the same story. Enough. This needed to end. No more illusions of mercy, no more half measures. Jon recalled a time when he had pitted Daenerys for her single-minded quest to seize the throne, for the relentless approach that had led to the tragedy at King's Landing. Now, it seemed he had become the tip of another relentless spear, one that could not turn back. Under cover of darkness, the Alliance forces slipped through the partially cleared gorge, crossing over the rubble and the corpses of their own men. Torches flickered, casting long shadows on the canyon walls. Distantly, the cry of a dragon echoed, a sound that seemed more mournful than threatening in the night air. Sorrow, an apt name for a beast whose existence heralded such misery. At dawn, they emerged into a hidden valley, an oasis of sorts nestled against rocky cliffs, dotted with sparse vegetation and a trickling stream. Huts and tents indicated a small settlement of loyalists. At the center, A rough-built altar of stone rose, presumably a place of worship for these last adherents of House Targaryen. The shadow of a dragon soared above, its silhouette gliding across the canyon walls. Jon's army fanned out, forming ranks on the valley floor. He rode at the front, scanning the area for any sign of Visenya. Then she appeared, a pale woman with hair as white as snow, standing on a ledge, her tattered cloak blowing in the hot wind. She bore a sword at her hip, and by her side perched a creature that must have been Sorrow. Though not as large as Night Maw, the dragon was still massive, its charcoal gray scales shimmering with a dull sheen. Its eyes were dark, reflecting no light, as if it carried the weight of doom within them. A chorus of hisses and shrieks rose from the valley's defenders. Perhaps 50 or so Targaryen loyalists, men and women brandishing swords, spears, and crossbows, prepared to fight to the death. Jon dismounted. He stepped forward, sword sheathed, hand raised to show he meant no immediate harm. A hush fell upon both sides. In the stillness, Visenya's voice rang out, cold and clear. "Jon Snow, betrayer of the blood, murderer of the queen, you come to finish what you started." Jon swallowed. He felt the eyes of his entire army on him. They expected him to give the order, to unleash scorpion bolts, to root out the last vestiges of Targaryen power. And yet, looking at Visenya, at Sorrow perched beside her, he experienced a stab of memory. Daenerys, radiant and alive, the same unearthly beauty, the same defiance. "It doesn't have to end this way," he said, voice echoing off the canyon walls. She laughed, the sound full of bitterness. "Yes, it does. You've cut us down wherever we stood. You've destroyed every dragon you could find. You would kill every child of Targaryen blood. Do you think I don't know what your armies have done in the name of safety?" She gestured at the settlement behind her, a ragged cluster of people. "We are all that's left. We are the last flicker of the Queen's flame." Jon took another step, ignoring the crossbows pointed at him. "Too many have died. There was a time when I believed dragons could help the world. But they've only brought death and fear. Look around, Visenya. You have no allies left. Surrender and we will spare." "You lie!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Spare us? Like you spared her? Like you spared King's Landing? You betray your own blood. We will never yield. We shall burn until our last breath." The dragon roared, smoke curling from its nostrils. Jon glanced at the scorpion teams arrayed behind him. They were waiting on his signal, bows taut, ballistae aimed, a lethal noose poised to tighten around the beast's neck. If he gave the command, they would unleash hell. And yet, a flicker of old sympathy burned in his chest, a memory of the Chainbreaker, the woman who had once seemed the best hope for a broken world. Was this truly the only way? In that moment of hesitation, Sorrow took flight, hurling itself from the ledge with a single mighty wing beat. Loyalist crossbowmen fired, and the Alliance ranks responded in kind. Arrows darkened the sky, men shouted, and the final battle began. Sorrow's fire lit the ledge in a harsh blaze, scorching Alliance soldiers who tried to advance up the slope. Visenya herself leapt into the fray, sword flashing in the desert sun, rallying her followers with a fervor born of despair. The valley erupted in chaos. Jon found himself locked in combat with two loyalists, their faces twisted in fanatic rage. He parried their blows, disarming them with quick slashes. He shouted for them to yield, but they fought on, heedless of self-preservation, until they lay dying in the dust. The raw devotion they displayed chilled him. This was not a typical battle for gold or glory. It was a last stand for belief, for a dream of fire and blood. Everywhere he looked, the Alliance overwhelmed the outnumbered loyalists. Yet the dragon soared overhead, unleashing blasts of flame that carved swaths through the coalition's ranks. Scorpion teams hurriedly repositioned, seeking clear shots. The sound of ropes creaking and bolts snapping forward mingled with the roars of men and beast alike. Some bolts struck true, chipping Sorrow's scales or lodging in the creature's wings. But the dragon moved fluidly, using the canyon walls for cover. Flames streaked down, setting siege engines ablaze. One Scorpion team was completely immolated, their screams echoing painfully. Still, more replaced them. The entire alliance had converged on this point, determined to end the Targaryen threat once and for all. Jon cut his way toward a vantage point on a boulder near the center of the valley. A swirl of dust and sand filled the air, stinging his eyes. Ghosts stayed close, snarling and snapping at any who threatened Jon's flank. Finally, Jon reached a position from which he could see Visenya. She was locked in combat with 3 Alliance soldiers, her movements a blur of desperation. One soldier went down, blood spurting from his throat. Another struck her side, but her armor deflected the blow. She cried out in fury. Sorrow let out an enraged roar, swinging around to dive-bomb the soldiers near her. "Scorpion teams there?" Jon bellowed, pointing toward the ledge where Sorrow was about to land. The men scrambled, turning the war machines. The dragon unleashed flame on those below, while Alliance archers rained arrows upon it. Time seemed to slow to a surreal pace. Jon could see Sorrow's every motion, the sunlight gleaming on its scales, the reflection of fire in its eyes. He saw Visenya break free of her melee, sprinting toward the spot where the dragon was descending, hoping to mount. If she reached Sorrow and took flight, the advantage might shift. Jon grimaced, raising his arm. The signal was clear. The scorpion bolts flew. Sorrow's roar of rage turned to one of pain as multiple barbed shafts struck the creature's flank and wing. Thrashed mid-landing, smashing into the ground. Visenya hurled herself aside, narrowly avoiding being crushed by the dragon's massive bulk. Another volley of bolts tore into Sorrow's belly, dark blood pouring onto the scorched sand. The dragon's eyes rolled in agony. Jon felt a knot of grief twist in his stomach. He could not deny that part of him still revered these creatures, as monstrous as they might be in war. But there was no turning back. Visenya scrambled toward the dragon, tears streaking her dust-covered face. She pressed her hands against its scales, whispering words that Jon could not make out. Sorrow let out a weak rumble, trying to lift its head. More scorpion bolts buried themselves in the creature's hide, shuddered, wings collapsing. In its death throes, Sorrow managed a final burst of flame, scorching a swath of Alliance soldiers who stood too close. Then the dragon slumped to the sand, still. Visenya screamed, a raw, inhuman sound of anguish. Jon approached slowly, sword in hand, while the remaining Alliance forces mopped up the last pockets of resistance. Visenya stared at him with hate-filled eyes, pressing a trembling hand to Sorrow's muzzle as if trying to comfort the dying beast. Jon felt the dryness in his throat, the weight of all his choices pressing down. At last, Sorrow's breathing stopped. The final living dragon loyal to Daenerys' line lay dead, pinned by scorpion bolts, its blood soaking into the barren earth. Visenya rose, ignoring the wound on her arm. Her sword was gone, lost in the chaos. Alliance spears bristled around her, men eager to deliver the final blow. Yet Jon raised a hand to hold them back. He moved closer, meeting her gaze. She spat at him, tears cutting rivulets through the dirt on her cheeks. "You think you've won? You think killing us all sets the world free? You've become death itself. Daenerys' dream was broken by you, again and again." Jon clenched his jaw. "Your queen raised cities, burned innocents. Dragons have brought nothing but sorrow to the world." He gestured at the fallen beast. "Look around you. Is this what you wanted?" She laughed, a hollow, despairing sound. "I wanted a world of wonder, a future lit by dragon flame. Yes, perhaps dangerous, but filled with magic and hope. Instead, you've created a future of cold, fearful hearts, guided by hatred. You kill children for the blood in their veins. Do you not see that you've become a monster greater than any dragon?" Jon's hands trembled. He heard the condemnation in her words and knew that much of it was true. Yet there was no path left to them now. The die had been cast. What other choice had there been? He could not let the world burn under dragon's wings. "Daenerys believed she was the only one who could save the world," he said quietly. "She believed so firmly that she nearly destroyed it. I won't let that happen again." Visenya's eyes shimmered with tears. Then she lunged at Jon, a hidden dagger gleaming in her hand. Before she could drive it into his chest, a dozen spears found her, piercing her body from every angle. She sank to her knees, blood staining her tattered robes, her eyes fixed on Jon, as if cursing him with her final breath. Then she fell, lifeless, beside the dragon she had adored. Jon stood there, panting, sword still in its scabbard. He had not struck the blow, but he felt the weight of it on his soul. The last of Daenerys's claimed heirs lay dead at his feet, and her dragon with her. Around them, the loyalist settlement burned. Some survivors were rounded up by the Alliance forces. Others lay dead in the sand. The stench of death was everywhere. As the sun rose higher, mercilessly beating down, Jon could not escape the feeling that something essential had been extinguished from the world. The great dragon hunt continued for several more years, though never again would the Alliance face a threat as organized as Aeron's or Visenya's forces. They rooted out scattered eggs, capturing rumored Targaryen children, though many rumors proved false or led to the tragic killing of innocents. Bit by bit, the last vestiges of dragonkind disappeared from the face of the earth. Tales of winged shadows and scorching flames became rare, relegated to the darkest corners of rumor. In time, even the fierce hearts of the Alliance grew weary of pursuit, content that no dragons remained. The deserts of Essos, the mountains of Sithorios, the seas beyond Westeros. Everywhere that a dragon might hide had been searched, ravaged by the unyielding tide of scorpion bolts and bloodshed. At last, on a bleak winter's day years later, Jon Snow walked the corridors of the Red Keep once more, alone. Word had spread throughout the Alliance that the dragons were gone, that House Targaryen was no more. The realm believed itself safe, and in that new calm, alliances frayed. Old grievances surfaced. Many parted ways, returning to their homelands with war-weary hearts. King's Landing had been rebuilt, though scars from Daenerys' assault could still be seen in certain alleys and blackened stone walls. Jon strode through the halls, hearing the echo of footsteps against the cold floors. Ghost had died some time ago, of old age, leaving Jon feeling more alone than ever. He reached the throne room, though it was no longer dominated by the Iron Throne, which had been melted in Daenerys' final rampage all those years ago. Bran, the king of the Six Kingdoms, sat on a simpler seat, attended by a sparse retinue. He gazed at Jon with eyes that seemed to contain centuries. "Is it done?" Bran asked softly, though he surely already knew the answer in his mysterious way. Jon nodded once. Everywhere across the known world, no dragons remain, and Daenerys' bloodline is ended. Bran's face was unreadable. At what cost? Jon did not answer. The cost was beyond measure. He felt it in his bones, in the hollowness that resided in his chest. He pictured Daenerys at Dragonstone, her eyes alight with dreams of breaking chains. He pictured the first time he had ridden a dragon, the exhilaration that soared through him. He pictured the thousands who had perished beneath Dragonflame and the thousands more who died in the hunt to exterminate them. Could there have been another path? The question haunted him, but no answer came. Bran sighed, rising from the seat. "The realm owes you a debt, Jon Snow," he said, though his tone carried no warmth. "You have done what many believed impossible. You have unified the world to achieve this end." Jon stared at his brother, searching for some hint of understanding or absolution. He found none. Bran, for all his knowledge, remained distant, as if perched outside of time itself. The silence was suffocating. At length, Jon simply bowed his head. He had not come seeking praise or condemnation. He had come only to see if his mission was truly finished. He turned away, leaving Bran alone in the throne room, and wandered into the courtyard where sunlight spilled between ancient stone arches. The city beyond bustled with life, merchants hawking wares, children laughing, the routine of daily existence. Yet a hush seemed to follow Jon wherever he went. People regarded him with a mixture of awe and unease. He was Jon Snow, the Dragonbane, the man who had ended the line of fire and blood. Some cheered him as a savior, Others whispered that he was a cursed figure, an omen of what lengths men would go to in the name of fear. He made his way through the city gates, walking alone, unaccompanied by guards. He passed through the ruins of the Dragon Pit, once the proud stable of Targaryen dragons, now a crumbled shell that had never been fully repaired. He stood amid the rubble, gazing at blackened stone arches. Bones had long since been cleared, but the ghosts of the past lingered. He closed his eyes, remembering Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, remembering the grace of their flight, the terror of their flames. Slowly, he sank to one knee, placing his hand on the cold ground. "We had no choice," he whispered, trying to convince himself. His voice echoed strangely in the empty dome. No choice at all. But deep down, a sorrow lodged itself in his heart, echoing the dragon's final roar. A sorrow that would never truly leave him. The dragons were gone, the bloodline of Daenerys Targaryen extinguished. Peace lay over the lands, or at least the promise of it. Yet Jon knew that the cost had been immeasurable, that something wondrous and ancient had been snuffed out by mortal fear and violence. He had done what was necessary, or so he believed, but in doing so, he had shattered the last fragment of a world touched by magic and dreams. He felt no triumph, only the burden of a future that stretched out, gray and ordinary, scarred by the memory of Dragonfire. He rose, dusted off his clothes, and set his face toward the horizon. Somewhere to the north lay Winterfell, the only true home he had ever known. Perhaps there, among the quiet snows and the stoic pines, he would find a measure of solace. Perhaps the ghosts would not follow him so closely. As he walked away from the shattered dragon pit, each step felt heavier than the last. A final gust of wind swept through the ruins, stirring a swirl of dust, as if a phantom wing had passed overhead. Then the dust settled, and the world carried on, as it always did, without dragons.